This is Resolute and the Resolute Podcast, where we make men better. I am Vince Miller, your host, and today we're in a series we're entitling Being a Better Husband. Today's topic is spiritual leadership in the home. Men, welcome back to the program. If this is your first time tuning in, well, thank you for joining us. The Resolute Podcast is produced multiple times each week. Come back often. Feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or find us in iTunes. And remember, we exist to make men better because we know today's men face unique personal challenges and an eroding understanding of biblical manhood. So we desire to help men grow spiritually by guiding them toward a spiritual game plan that will launch them toward being better men, fathers, husbands, and leaders. Because we believe when you make one man better, everyone gets better. For more information on our spiritual mentoring program for individuals and groups, go to beresolute.org. We also have numerous great tools for men on our website, one being our free Men's Daily Devo. It's short, straightforward, and sweet to get in your inbox. Please check out our resources if you want to grow in your faith. But now let's dive in. Today we are looking at the topic of spiritual leadership in the home, and over the next few episodes I'm going to be sitting with Keith TerHaar, and we are sharing with you about how we have sharpened our skill in our marriage as men. And there's a couple of reasons that we've been setting together to share with you this wisdom. First, because we have worked with men in marriages for about the last 20 years. Keith has been a professional licensed marriage counselor, and I've counseled men pastorally for about a combined 40 years. And since we both work with men, we share stories on how men are handling the issues of life. And in hopes of finding better ways to address these challenges, we came together for a few podcasts here. So, Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You know, this topic of spiritual leadership in the home, I think, is one that is like almost emotionally challenging for guys. I think it's a hard topic to address because I think that some of us have tried it and failed. Therefore, we kind of give up on it. I mean, it's because I think we're kind of inspired by pastors and churches to lead in our home. We're told that we need to do it. We read it in the Bible, and yet we're devoid on really what that's supposed to look like and how we're supposed to do it. My question to you to kick this off is part of this maybe a failed image of what spiritual leadership really looks like? Could that be part of the issue?
I definitely think it has been for me.
Okay.
And, you know, even when I hear the term spiritual leadership in the home, I sweat a little bit, right? Because it feels like this overwhelming responsibility of a Christian man. You know, that if you're really going to be the man God wants you to be, you better be a really strong leader in your home. And that leads to, I think, pressing and feeling like you have to make something happen and feeling like, for me, responsible for the spiritual health of my whole family. And while I want to be an influence there, and I want to be a good model, I think to take responsibility for that was overstepping and taking me into kind of a setup situation where, you know, if I tried and it didn't work out, that my kids and my wife didn't respond with, thank you so much for that spiritual revelation, then I was a failure.
Boy, that is exceptional, Keith, seriously, because I think that part of it sounds like from what you're saying, is misinterpreted expectations regarding the words spiritual leadership. And just to say back to you what I heard you say, because I thought it was so good, is that we have this misconception when we hear the word spiritual leadership that we are spiritually responsible for the faith of our family, when what I hear you saying is we have a responsibility to influence it, not to own it personally. That really God is responsible for the nourishment and the care of our family, including our children and our wife. We just are part of the piece of the puzzle as we steward the resources of our home, including our family. So that kind of lets me down a little bit. Yeah. But I don't hear you letting me off the hook completely, right? Like, spiritual leadership's got to mean something. It can't mean that I just sit around and don't do anything and be an imbecile, right? And it doesn't mean that I quit and give up either. So do you think that we fail to have maybe a good model for what this looks like then?
I did. As much as I look back at my upbringing and I saw certain things that my dad did, I look at my family now and the current age we live in, and things are very different. And so I think while there are certain things I've gleaned from what my dad showed me, there are other things that are just so different, and they require me to maybe take more time to try to understand what my wife wants and needs from me, what my kids do. So it's a little bit of a game of figuring it out, what they really need, and trying to be faithful. I think the one thing I do feel like is be faithful to be doing and living out what I want my kids to see in me. And it doesn't mean that, when they walk in the room, I quick take out my Bible to show that I'm doing devotions, but it means that I'm doing, I am reading my Bible regularly, and if I'm doing that, they are going to see me at times, and they are going to hear me talk about my faith because it's important. So if I'm not living that, there's no credibility to my leadership in that.
Yeah. One of my challenges, Keith, was the fact that I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and because of that, I never really witnessed what spiritual leadership looks like, right? Until I moved in with my grandfather when I was in my teens, and then I started to witness, he was a Christian, so I started to witness what spiritual leadership in the home looked like. And if I look back on that, it looked like reading the Bible together, it looked like sitting at the table, praying together, it looked like the occasional coaching or mentoring that came from my grandfather in a spiritual way, spiritual discussions that were sometimes planned and sometimes impromptu. It was a number of different items that I witnessed. But after my grandfather was gone, before I even met my wife, I then found that I'm kind of on this journey alone. Here I am, a guy with 3 teenage children right now, trying to figure out how to spiritually lead my home. And most of the time, I feel like I'm underperforming, to be quite honest with you. I do feel like this sense of regret or guilt or underperforming in spiritual leadership in the home. And when me and my wife first got married, we were first married, I was, going to grad school, getting my MDiv degree. And I remember I felt this pressure to spiritually lead, and I came home right away to share with my wife all the things that I was learning in seminary, right? And oh boy, that was not a good experience. I thought that I was doing the right thing to spiritually lead in the home, and my wife felt like I was standing up a podium in the house and preaching at her. And it really turned my wife off to my spiritual leadership. And it took years to reconcile that. Even today, I feel like I'm trying to make up for some of that lost time. But I have found that there are certain spiritual exercises that work for me and my wife, that work for me and my kids, and I've just slowly tried to import those. Can you share with me one that you use to lead your family in your home?
A few years back, when our kids got really busy in those middle school years, and I had to drive them everywhere, I was spending hours of time in the car, right?
Decades, yeah.
And the beauty of that is that you have a very captive audience.
Yes.
And so there's opportunity to have meaningful conversations about life. For me, there was also an opportunity as we got closer to the destination to say to my kids, hey, would it be okay if I prayed for you for a minute before you go to your game or your practice or whatever? And teenage kids, they'll initially maybe roll their eyes a little bit or look at you kind of funny and say, well, okay. And it's something that I continued to do, and it became very normal to them. And I was glad that it became something that they felt like, it's just what my dad does. Because sometimes I do it with their friends too, and I'm sure they're like, Dad, really? But it's just what I did. And I missed that. And so now that they're driving, I don't have that car time, but I do still make a point before they leave in the morning when I can to say, hey, let me pray for you a minute. And it's one little thing, but it's one thing that I think they'll remember. And it's one way that I think I'm living out my worldview that, hey, before we do stuff, let's bring that to God and pray for it, ask His blessing on it, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I think I hear multiple things in what you're saying, which is really powerful. It's like, do simple things, do things that are naturally a course of everyday life. Do them when they make you uncomfortable, or sometimes your kids or family members slightly uncomfortable. Don't overthink it. You don't have to over-prepare for it. I mean, I hear so many things in what you're saying, and it helps me to bring down the expectations in my own mind about what spiritual leadership really looks like. I'm not responsible for their faith, but I'm responsible for influencing their faith, is what it sounds like good spiritual leadership looks like. Here's a few verses. These are very familiar. We often read these, of course, for our wives, right? But we should hear them as a husband, right? So Ephesians 5:22-30 reads, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. But then, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." That sounds like spiritual leadership, right? That he might sanctify her. So there's some sanctification there. Having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle, or in any such thing, that she might be holy without blemish. And in the same way, husbands should love their wives, that she might be holy without blemish. I love that. I think that it's describing that we have this opportunity to be in a sanctification process at home, and we have the responsibility to care for. I mean, he's not saying that you should stand up and preach the word to your wife or your kids. He's saying that we should be a part of that process. And I love it, because it brings us out of these false expectations, and even some of this inward guilt that I have, that I can do small things. So, Keith, going back to your previous point, it sounds like a great call to action would be something as simple as finding a spiritual discipline that can engage your family members with, like finding captive moments to pray for them.
Yeah, that's been my best one. I failed miserably at other attempts to sit them down and let's read something together, and let's have some worship time. Those are all good things, but they haven't connected with my family.
Right.
And my wife and my kids, they don't immediately submit in terms of obey dad regardless. They question me, or they'll ask why, or they'll need me to kind of build trust and rapport with them around some of these things. So I think to find something small that works, like you said, in those captive moments, that is meaningful.
That's good. Let me add two to that I thought of. Okay. When my kids were real young, I used to pull out my guitar. And I used to sing worship songs to them before bedtime. I'd gather them all up on a bed and sing worship songs to them, just a few. And then as my kids have gotten older, actually teenagers now, so my youngest one is 13. And you're going to laugh at this, but I actually play my podcast for him in the car. So instead of teaching him, I'm teaching him through radio. And it has been such a discussion starter. It's remarkable. We have a little bit of a 15-minute drive, and I just turn on the podcast and play it. And he asks me a question or two, and we talk about it. Isn't that interesting? It's just so simple.
It is. A friend of mine had one. I'll throw it out real quick.
Yeah.
And he said his kids just loved it, and it was at bedtime. And he called it, I think, One Question. And so he would allow his kids to ask him one question, anything. And there was something just alluring about it to his kids that built this kind of energy and excitement and anticipation around it. And when he wouldn't do it, they'd be like, "Dad, what about one question?" And he said it was just an incredible way to build relationship with his kids. And sometimes the question was about something silly, and sometimes it was much more serious, but it was a great way to connect deeply with his kids.
Well, yeah, what a great way to put yourself in the place of a mentor. Right, for your children. That's really good. One question. Probably not going to work so great with my wife, but, but with my kids,
maybe.
It's wonderful. That's an absolute. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Well, guys, that's the show. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast today, but please know the time we spent together is worthless unless you decide to act on it, and I want you to act on it. If I can help you in any way, I want you to reach out to me personally and send me an email at info@beresolute.org. So guys, get off the bench, get into the game, and join us next time for another edition of the Resolute Podcast.